Well, good afternoon. My name is Nick Hernandez. I am the director of Makoche Agriculture Development here on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, and Makoche means homelands in my native tongue. Um, and Makoche is basically a freshman organization that was developed coming up here in July as an organization focused on agriculture and food systems development in Indian country. So basically, I have a history of learning about food sovereignty, food security, and also being a tribal member of the Oglala Sioux tribe of the Great Plains, the Upper Great Plains. And I'm a tribal member, a father of two, partner, and me and my partner have two boys here on our homelands. And so I started Makoche Agriculture with the intent to develop agriculture and food systems, because here on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in the state of South Dakota in the U.S., we are one of 9 bands of the Ocheti Shakoi, which is basically the overall peoples, and we're split into bands. And so here on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, we live on 2.7 million acres, and overall throughout the Great Plains, we manage as stewards of the land, basically about 10 million acres. But here, significantly, here on the Pine Ridge Reservation, we have 2.7 million acres that we manage. That breaks down into basically different sectors or sections of lands: fee land, paid land, tribal land, and then tribal allotted land. And this was all due to acts and treaties with the federal government. But our lands are identified and are identified as kind of one of those pure lands, pure grasslands. If we're talking about grasslands, we're talking about lands that are undisturbed. Lands that have a lot of thriving ecosystems, thriving ecology, and that's here on my homelands. A lot of natural grasslands and stuff. And so, Makoche Agriculture, my organization, is basically invested in taking that opportunity to revitalize ourselves, due to historical political ties and treaties and stuff. We've come to a point where we are under an underserved population. We have broken treaties and stuff, and so throughout these last 5 years of learning about food sovereignty, talking about younger generations, about rebuilding ourselves, and talk about that we used to have sustainable economies through food systems. And so what I envision is bringing back that way of life, reconnecting ourselves not only through food, but also the food systems that we've become disconnected from. And so here we were basically 2 generations separated from hands in the soil, 2 generations separated from being connected from our food sources. And so the intent from Makoche Ag, in partnership with other local grassroots organizations, is to rebuild a food system that will help us develop ourselves as a people, develop an economy that doesn't exist, but also reconnect ourselves back to an environment that we've seemed to have forgotten. We've adopted to Western thought, to Western styles, to Western trends, and so Makoche is fully invested into taking back our livelihoods, and we're seeing that now in this time of a global pandemic, how disconnected we are from our food and food systems. Relative from our livelihood of Unchi Maka, of the earth, the soil, the water. And so as you hear throughout continents, as you hear throughout regions, as you hear throughout communities, we need to get back to that way of life. We need to get back to that connection, because our disconnect is basically our pandemic right now. And so Mokoche is invested in those small opportunities of rebuilding food systems, um, utilizing our land to create these systems, working with modern technologies, to build grocery stores, build processing centers, but also reconnect ourselves through, you know, holistic, traditional, um, ways of meats, reconnecting to foods, fruits and vegetables and stuff, and being able to pass that on to the next generation. Because right now, like I said, we're two generations separated from understanding anything that grows on our homelands. And so, you know, a lot of, you know, indigenous people, um, a lot of native people, you know, want change. And in the reality are changes in how we reconnect with our food and our food systems, and how it makes us feel. Because food in its natural state is more healthy than anything that we consume. um, but we live, you know, and that's the intent of Makoche Ag, is to create those systems that don't exist. You know, we have statistics that put us up against the wall. 50% higher, 500% higher diabetes rates. Statistics that are all associated to what we consume as a people due to Western trends. And so the intent is to create these to, to create these systems that are more visible, that are more local, that are more determined to recharge a people, that are more determined to recharge an economy, to recharge a social environment, and to utilize, you know, everything in our surrounding ecosystem. And for us, we are people of the Buffalo Nation. And when we're talking about grasslands, when we're talking about ecosystems, one of the keystone species is buffalo. And for us, we want to be able to build those opportunities right now in this state of in this state of production. We have one buffalo to basically every 100 head of cattle. So we want to be able to reverse those numbers and have a larger buffalo population that serves a purpose for healthier meats, but also serves a purpose as a keystone species for the grasslands. And the numbers are low in comparison to the markets of, you know, to the economies of cattle. But we got to think about those keystone species that are real significant if we're to understand our reconnectiveness to to our environment, to our ecosystem. And that all comes with foundational education. A lot of this stuff is not learned. A lot of this stuff is mainly hands-on and interactive, and becoming involved, with the outdoor, with our environment. And so Makoja Ag is invested in partnering, in bringing in those opportunities to flourish, but also bringing in those opportunities for funding opportunities, so that ideas like this can move faster to more fruition, so that they benefit, you know, the people who see the value in that reconnectedness, but also the value in acquiring more healthy food, and building economy, and providing more education and more programs. And so the strategies are there, the ideas, the plans are there, but you know, philanthropy is out there looking for opportunities, and you know, as indigenous people, as peoples in our communities, we have the ideas, we have that grassroots thought, and especially we have, you know, generations of reconnectedness that need to be, that just basically needed to be dusted off, that basically needed to be retaught, on how we live in these environments during these times. And right now is that huge opportunity to reconnect in the time of a global pandemic, which, you know, is taking major hits in the Western society. Indigenous thought, indigenous education, and reconnection to our land, is one of the key things that we need to do in order to make a healthier future for the next generations.
Ok, bueno, soy María Elena Rodarte García, directora de la región norte y Sierra Madre Occidental de la Comisión Nacional de Áreas Naturales Protegidas, y a nombre del comisionado nacional, el biólogo Roberto Aviña Carlín, les extiendo un agradecimiento y un saludo, y vamos a presentar lo que estamos haciendo en la Comisión Nacional de Áreas Naturales Protegidas, particularmente en 2 regiones donde se inscribe toda la superficie del desierto chihuahuense y en particular las áreas de pastizal. Los pastizales nosotros reconocemos que son benéficos para el desarrollo de la humanidad, ya que los granos que se consumen a nivel mundial son el maíz, el trigo, el arroz centeno, la cebada, y son del grupo de los pastos. Por lo tanto, consideramos, igual que los otros panelistas, que la relación entre el desarrollo agropecuario, agrícola y ganadero, y el manejo de los pastos es una relación histórica que también ha contribuido al desarrollo biocultural de la humanidad. Reconocemos que el desierto chihuahuense es una gran ecorregión binacional que abarca 63 millones de hectáreas, donde el 75% de la superficie se encuentra en México. El desierto chihuahuense, nosotros lo reconocemos y lo hemos estudiado, contiene una alta diversidad de endemismos, de plantas y vertebrados, y sostiene a más del 90% de las especies de aves de pastizal en el oeste del continente. Funciona como el sustento indispensable para sostener la alta biodiversidad y provee de servicios ambientales invaluables, entre ellos el forraje, el secuestro de carbono, la generación de suelos, la prevención de la desertificación, el mantenimiento de nutrientes, la regulación del clima, es hábitat de numerosas especies de pequeños mamíferos, de aves, de reptiles, de insectos, en fin. En la actualidad, los pastizales solamente ocupan el 15% de esta ecorregión, por lo tanto, se considera que ha sido drásticamente reducida la superficie, particularmente en los últimos 50 años, derivado de la expansión de la frontera agrícola. A mediados del siglo XIX se reporta que los pastizales nativos prácticamente estaban libres de arbustos. Sin embargo, ahora vemos que la mayor parte de la superficie de pastizales tiene no solo pastos, sino también otras especies de mayor tamaño que en muchos de los casos han sido introducidas. Debido a su manejo inadecuado, se encuentran en un proceso de gran degradación, ¿verdad? De una degradación ecológica importante, derivado justamente de la ganadería mal planificada, desordenada, con una capacidad muy grande de cabezas de ganado, ¿verdad? Es decir, con un gran número de cabezas de ganado. La urbanización, ¿verdad? Es decir, el crecimiento de asentamientos humanos, de poblaciones, también ha dado paso a lo que es la fractura de los pastizales, la pérdida de esta gran superficie, lo que le llamamos el cambio de uso de suelo, la presencia de especies exóticas invasoras, sobre todo especies que han sido, especies de zacates, ¿verdad? De pastos que han sido introducidos en muchas ocasiones por los propios programas de fomento ganadero y agropecuario, por el fomento que hace el gobierno a través de subsidios a los dueños de los ranchos y a los ganaderos particulares, ¿no? En este mapa estamos presentando las áreas que se muestran en la estrategia de conservación de pastizales del desierto chihuahuense, publicada en 2011, que es un documento guía que establece prácticamente las líneas de acción las estrategias para la conservación de los pastizales del desierto chihuahuense y las especies asociadas a ellas. Como vemos, son bastantes áreas que son prioritarias, tanto en el estado de Sonora, en el estado de Chihuahua, en el estado de Durango y en el estado de Coahuila. Algunas de estas áreas coinciden con áreas naturales protegidas de carácter federal, que son competencia de la Comisión Nacional de Áreas Naturales Protegidas, ¿verdad?, que están decretadas por el presidente de la República. Algunas de las áreas también no se encuentran dentro de algún esquema de protección. Sin embargo, pues ahora sí que se ha promovido la elaboración de estudios técnicos que justifiquen la creación de nuevas áreas naturales protegidas o el establecimiento de algunas otras modalidades de conservación que tiene o que promueve el gobierno federal a través de la CONAM, como son las áreas voluntarias certificadas a la conservación. En este caso, en Cuchillas de la Zarca, que es un área de pastizales en muy buen estado de conservación entre los estados de Chihuahua y Durango, ¿verdad? Contamos con estos estudios técnicos. Entonces, aquí se muestran en este plano, pues en el caso de Janos, de valles centrales, de las lagunas del Este, Cuchillas de la Zarca, Mapimí, el Valle de Colombia, Cuatro Ciénegas y el Tokio, como una de las áreas que también son importantes para la conservación de aves de pastizal. Muchas de estas áreas han sido trabajadas por diferentes iniciativas, tanto de México como de Estados Unidos. Sin embargo, sí consideramos que necesitan más apoyo, sobre todo en términos de proyectos y financiamiento. En este otro plano, ustedes lo que pueden ver son las áreas naturales protegidas ya, los polígonos de las ANPs que maneja la Comisión Nacional de Áreas Naturales Protegidas, particularmente en el estado de Chihuahua, Durango, Coahuila, Zacatecas, Tamaulipas, etcétera, ¿no? Entonces, aquí ustedes pueden ver la lista de las ANPs, está Maderas del Carmen, Cuatro Ciénegas, Cañón de Santa Elena, la Reserva de la Biosfera Mapimí, Ocampo, la cuenca alimentadora del Distrito Nacional de Riego Don Martín, el área de protección de flora y fauna médanos de Samalayuca, el Parque Nacional Cumbres de Majalca y el Parque Nacional Sierra de Órganos en Zacatecas. Prácticamente estamos abarcando la mitad del país en diferentes esquemas de conservación y de manejo, ¿verdad? Cada categoría de manejo, en el caso de las áreas de protección de flora y fauna, está específica para la protección justamente y conservación de la flora y fauna. En el caso de las reservas de la biosfera se considera también no solo representaciones biogeográficas, la presencia de flora y fauna en riesgo, sino también la interacción cultural que hay entre el hombre y la biosfera, ¿verdad? Tenemos parques nacionales. Los parques nacionales prácticamente están decretados y reconocidos por su belleza escénica, por la integridad de sus paisajes y por la oportunidad que tiene para realizar actividades más encaminadas al turismo de naturaleza. ¿Qué es lo que estamos haciendo en la CONAM? A través de fondos que prácticamente son fondos destinados del propio gobierno federal para las áreas naturales protegidas. Hay también fondos internacionales que se reciben en el caso de, por ejemplo, de la Reserva de la Biosfera Janos, del Fondo para el Medio Ambiente Mundial, del GEF, en diferentes proyectos que se han llevado a cabo ahí. Ahora estamos aplicando fondos privados, ¿verdad? A través del Fondo Mexicano para la Conservación de la Naturaleza. Y lo que hemos estado impulsando, como les comentaba, era la iniciativa de nuevas áreas naturales protegidas decretadas por el Ejecutivo, por el Presidente de la República, particularmente para conservar los pastizales centrales del desierto chihuahuense, el área también de Cuchillas de la Zarca, que son los pastizales que están entre Chihuahua y Durango, el cañón del Peguis, que es un área de conectividad ecológica también con el cañón de Santa Elena, ¿verdad? Más en una visión de conectividad ecológica y de conservar los paisajes de pastizal que afortunadamente todavía tenemos, ¿verdad? Y las áreas destinadas voluntariamente a la conservación, que son iniciativas privadas o de ejidos o de comunidades agrarias que tienen el interés de conservar alguna superficie de su propiedad, implementando mejores prácticas, ¿verdad? Aquí las áreas voluntarias destinadas a la conservación no son áreas restrictivas donde no sea posible hacer nada, sino prácticamente lo que nosotros queremos es inducir a las mejores prácticas, en este caso para el manejo de pastizales, sería la ganadería sostenible, en muchos casos también la agricultura orgánica, la agroecología, como lo veíamos en las presentaciones anteriores, son iniciativas muy importantes, sobre todo para trabajar con los dueños de la tierra, que son, digamos, nuestro principal objetivo en las estrategias de conservación de la biodiversidad y los paisajes y los ecosistemas. Otra de las acciones o de los trabajos que más estamos realizando es el tema de la recuperación de especies en riesgo. Es una línea estratégica también de la Comisión Nacional a nivel nacional en todas las áreas naturales protegidas y particularmente en lo que se refiere al desierto chihuahuense y a las áreas de pastizal. Estamos trabajando en la recuperación y la reintroducción del bisonte americano, que es una especie emblemática que reconocemos que es una especie binacional o trinacional, ¿verdad? Porque su hábitat natural pues es prácticamente todo el desierto chihuahuense, desde Norteamérica hasta el centro de México. La reintroducción y recuperación del berrendo americano, ahí hemos tenido también buenos logros, también con la cooperación con Estados Unidos, con el Servicio de Caza y Pesca. Nos han donado hace año y medio una manada de 100 berrendos mexicanos que reintrodujimos en algunos ranchos aquí en el estado de Chihuahua, en lo que le llamamos la zona de influencia de la Reserva de la Biosfera Janos. Con mucho éxito se cruzaron, ¿verdad? Se encontraron con las manadas que hay aquí y se están reproduciendo. Tenemos también acciones de monitoreo biológico para el caso de aves de pastizal y en particular para el halcón aplomado, para el águila real, para el perrito llanero de cola negra. Y hay una estrategia que ahora está impulsando particularmente el secretario Víctor Manuel Toledo y el comisionado nacional, y es esta idea de producir conservando, ¿verdad? Es decir, acompañar a los dueños de la tierra, proporcionarles medios, es decir, subsidios, recursos financieros, tanto federales como internacionales, ¿verdad? Para hacer mejores prácticas agrícolas, mejores prácticas ganaderas, la recuperación de áreas de pastizal que fueron sometidas a prácticas inadecuadas, ¿verdad? De siembra de pastos, como les decía, el tema de los pastos exóticos es muy fuerte y es muy difícil de manejar. El fomento a la ganadería regenerativa, el fomento a las mejores prácticas agrícolas, que yo lo había comentado, el control de especies exóticas e invasoras, el desarrollo de huertos familiares, que es una forma tradicional de producir o de llevar a cabo actividades agrícolas que están enfocadas prácticamente al sustento de las familias, ¿verdad? A producir alimentos sanos, ¿verdad? Libres de pesticidas, libres de agroquímicos, más en el sentido de la parcela familiar, donde no solo son plantas alimenticias, son plantas condimenticias, ornamentales, medicinales, son animales, ¿verdad? Como gallinas, puercos, vacas también, pero más en el sentido del sostenimiento de las familias, más que de una estrategia de comercialización a gran escala, ¿no? Obras de captación de agua, creemos que el agua es uno de los elementos naturales estratégicos que nos está llevando muchas crisis actualmente, ¿verdad? Tenemos incluso situaciones de conflicto social derivado de la apertura de pozos, de la apertura ilegal de pozos, sobre todo en todo lo que es la parte del semidesierto. Viveros para la producción de, por ejemplo, en este caso de sotol, en el caso de las plantas del desierto, pero también apoyamos viveros para la producción de plantas para elaborar artesanías, para materiales de construcción, etcétera. Entonces, esta es la idea de producir y conservar. Digamos, de alguna manera, hacer viable la idea de que necesitamos conservar los satisfactores para el sostenimiento de la población humana. También tenemos mucho trabajo en lo que se refiere a la gobernanza y participación social, ¿verdad? Todas nuestras áreas naturales protegidas en México tienen gente, ¿verdad? Los dueños de la tierra son particulares, son ejidos, son colectivos, digamos, agrarios y comunidades agrarias. Por lo tanto, la única estrategia y la mejor estrategia es trabajar con las personas en términos de lo que es la toma de decisiones sobre el uso y disfrute de los recursos naturales y en particular para la conservación de los ecosistemas y su biodiversidad. Entonces, nosotros tenemos una forma, digamos, de planificación del uso de los recursos naturales en las áreas naturales protegidas, que son los consejos asesores, que de alguna manera validan los programas de manejo de las áreas naturales protegidas. Cada área natural protegida tiene que tener un instrumento de planeación destinado a la conservación y el uso sustentable de los recursos naturales y se cristaliza en el documento que se denomina Programa de Manejo de un Área Natural Protegida. Tenemos reuniones especiales con sectores ganaderos, agrícolas, incluso con los sectores mineros, la iniciativa privada, etcétera, para ponernos de acuerdo en cómo llevar a cabo las mejores acciones de conservación de un área natural protegida. También trabajamos muy fuertemente en lo que es educación ambiental y la cultura para la conservación, realizando pláticas y talleres con productores, ganaderos, agrícolas, con el sector menonita, que digamos el grupo menonita, la población, más bien un grupo étnico de alguna manera, con el que tenemos que ir muy de la mano, ¿verdad? Ellos son dueños de grandes superficies de terreno, sobre todo para el área de los pastizales centrales, lejanos, y pues son personas que tienen un poder adquisitivo alto y por lo tanto tienen interés en producir muchos alimentos a gran escala, y ahí tenemos que trabajar mucho con ellos de la mano a efecto de ir cambiando poco a poco la idea, la noción de cómo realizar la agricultura sin el deterioro de los pastizales y por ende de las especies asociadas a ellos, ¿no? Hacemos también ferias, exposiciones en cabeceras municipales a efecto de dar a conocer a la gente lo que son las áreas naturales protegidas, las oportunidades para vivir de alguna manera con más bienestar, ¿no? Vivir con una mejor calidad de vida, conservar la biodiversidad, los paisajes, y ver que hay otras opciones de vida, no solo lo que es la producción agrícola o ganadera, sino que puede haber el turismo, digamos, la actividad cinegética bastante regulada, etcétera. Entonces se trata de ir difundiendo también a través de redes sociales estos mensajes que resaltan los valores biológicos de las áreas naturales protegidas y en particular en el caso de los pastizales, la importancia de conservar los pastizales por los servicios ambientales que proveen para la conservación no solo de las poblaciones humanas, sino de la vida, ¿no? En general, de la diversidad biológica. Prácticamente eso es lo que nosotros estamos realizando en el tema de pastizales. Para nosotros, ahorita el tema presupuestal es un tema que nos enfoca, ¿verdad?, a tener prioridades, sobre todo en materia de conservación. Eso sería por mi parte. Gracias.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Although I'm not quite sure, I want to say thank you, since my job is to respond to all of these amazing presentations and so much information, and I'm finding it a bit overwhelming, but I will do my little bit here to try to take stock of all that was just said. And, you know, perhaps like me, you came into this whole process thinking of, you know, why do we need a roadmap? Are we lost? And enough times I've heard people say that when you're out on the prairie, there are no landmarks. It's pretty damn easy to be lost. But listening to all these talks, I really don't think we're lost. I hear loud and clear what we're losing, but I also see that we're all trying to turn the ship around together. So I am very energized by what I hear, but also struggling to take stock of it all. And we were asked some questions leading into this, and one of them was, how might an international roadmap work? And right in that question itself is the word international, and I really think that that is perhaps one of the biggest keys, that we will need to be international. We will need to work together across nations, across countries, and that of course includes First Nations. And we will need to be perhaps just as incredibly dynamic as our grasslands are, in order to overcome the political jurisdictional paraphernalia that so often divides us. And let's face it, society is not speaking in unison on this topic. So I'm really going to try to focus a little bit on the international part in bringing some Canadian perspective to things. I think otherwise what we will have is, you know, we may be able to keep our own pieces of grass, and we may be able to keep some of our own key components, but we will lose the bigger functionality of the large ecosystem that connects us from Canada to Mexico. And that, in fact, is essential for many of the migratory animals that move within that great system. I mean, the challenges to all of this, well, and to a roadmap, of course, there's political challenges, there's political square lines on maps and jurisdictional challenges. And I might add that in Canada, we are certainly no stranger to the problem of too many fences. We have very different rural municipalities and provincial differences that can make it difficult for us even to talk to our neighbors, even across a grassland with little topography. And you know, like one of the challenges, for example, listening to Mike's talk, you know, like just the numbers that Mike is giving for Playa Larga and some of the southern joint ventures in terms of easements and the things, we are really struggling in Canada to get to that level of buy-in and support. And so I see that as something to really ponder on for us as a challenge. But I actually think that what I'm hearing more in the presentations so far is not just aligning across jurisdictions, but it's really the alignment across sectors that is going to be key for this. And I actually start with Matt Lauer's comment right in the opening presentation. He said that it used to be you either farmed or you protected habitat, and now we need to do both. And I completely agree with that sentiment. And I think that, you know, doing both of those things at once is precisely what the roadmap exercise is about. But it is going to have to be beautifully nuanced and complex, just as dynamic as our grasslands are, if we're going to protect all the pieces and leave enough grass right side up, not just for its own sake, but for the connectivity between it from throughout the Great Plains. And if we don't do that, species like, for example, this beautiful chestnut-coated longspur, which in Canada we've lost 90% of this bird's population, and of course they're going to Mexico to winter. And if we don't, their ability to move between our countries and our jurisdictions will no longer be there, as many other speakers have already alluded to. So another challenge in Canada, we don't have an equivalent of a farm bill up here, and I've long pondered on this question and what it means for Canada. And right now, instead of that, we are heavily invested in basically what we're calling sectoral strategies. And this talk cannot be a lot about programming or detail. This is going to be very big, sweeping strokes response to other speakers. But I will say that we are really trying very hard now to get our ducks in a row in terms of an agricultural sector strategy in Canada, and there's others on this call who are involved in that who can speak better to it. So we are trying to align our conservation initiatives with our agricultural sector here, and Environment and Climate Change Canada. This is certainly a priority for us. At the same time as saying that, I want to recognize that we haven't always done this right. We've made lots of mistakes about this, and listening to Miles Anderson, for example, on the first day of presentations, I think actually we owe a great debt of gratitude to Miles and others like him for getting riled and rolling up their sleeves and getting down to work and sort of showing smart aleck biologists like myself the consequences when you mess with fundamental ecosystem processes like grazing in a grassland. And in fact, we might not even have any greater sage grouse, this species here, left in Saskatchewan, Canada, if it weren't for the folks like Miles. And every time that I feel frustrated with the slow progress, with the democratic progress, with the sort of cumberness of the cumbersome nature and the clumsiness of the few international tools that are at our disposal, I always want to remember those mistakes and the need to bring in and work with community in order not to repeat those mistakes. And so this has been talked about, especially by Jim, but also by a few other people. Actually, it's been really interesting to read several op-eds recently, and in particular, an open letter to the Canadian Prime Minister, calling for, in effect, an agricultural revolution, that word agroecology that Jim introduced. So it's very, and Nick also talked about this, it's been extremely interesting in the context of a global pandemic to see words like food security and food sovereignty rise to the top and be put in a spotlight. And please don't get me wrong, I'm not speaking in any way in a nationalistic sense here, but I do think that this is opening up a conversation around food production in situ, around food production regionally, and alignment of food production with biodiversity preservation that, maybe will get us to our societal conversation about ecosystem and landscape and what those things mean, and ecosystem process and function and dynamism and what that means. And so I just want to share this Google Earth image. This is from, I guess, my little corner of the world. You could say I spent 20 years in Manitoba, and this is where I learned to fall in love with prairie. In fact, this is where all of the photos that I've taken in this presentation come from. Here you're looking at southwestern Manitoba, southern Saskatchewan, and northern North Dakota. And if you're like me, the first thing that you'll see in this image is a bunch of little green squares. And that's because the whole thing is completely divvied up into sections and quarter sections, and there really isn't any more of that sea of grass that people have talked about. You look hard to find it. You maybe see a glimpse of it if you visit a very large community pasture, some of the few large community pastures we have left. But we were asked what the greatest needs of the grasslands were, and I would say it's really space and time. This all needs space to grow again. It needs space to die back, and time to be grazed and browsed and burnt and windswept. It needs time for all those dynamic processes to interact, for the water to come, for the water to go, for the roots to carry all that sunlight deep down in the earth, and all of those amazingly complicated underground processes that others have talked about, which we don't see, but which are so integral to this system. And yet, contrast that with the way our society operates. You know, we love our straight lines, we love divvying everything up into parcels, everything is spoken for, allotted for, and even if, as Monica told us, even if some get an ever decreasingly small share, so with space at a premium, this is, I think, more important than ever. And it's important really that we do it regionally. I think that we really need to understand the differences as well as the similarities that we share. Because of course, one of the great ironies of biodiversity is that you can work very hard to increase biodiversity at a site or a small scale, but you might actually be decreasing biodiversity at a planetary scale or a continental scale if you don't allow the natural ecosystems to maintain their function. And of course, none of this is necessarily my idea, and this is not new. And even Nick spoke to this, you know, for example, with the bison and living with the dynamic nature of the bison and their vagrancies across the Great Plains, and what happens when you take away, you know, the foundation of the economies of so many of the people of the Great Plains, not to mention the ecosystems. So I have to salute all those working to restore bison and all of the things that we're fighting to restore, other things that we're losing, even the really small beings that we've lost, like the extinction of the Rocky Mountain grasshopper and what that means, and how we really must not allow that to happen again. And so, it's sort of in summary and trying to make sense of all of this, and I guess we, you know, the big idea, the big innovation, the big proposal for a vision for grassland conservation, you know, my new dawn sort of thinking of this is that we really absolutely need a large scale international mechanism, and it must have a focus on healthy communities and healthy ecosystems at the same time, to do both, as Matt Lauer talked about in the opening presentation. Obviously, from all these presentations, you can see there is a lot of great stuff going on. There's a lot of awesome programs. I'm extremely encouraged to, with the 8 joint ventures, the JB8 that was mentioned in Mike's talk, and this idea of connecting 8 joint ventures between 3 countries and across so many jurisdictions. But I still think that ultimately we are going to have to really get this right by integrating even better. And it's going to have to be, in fact, get to the point where we embed this into our political systems. And as Nick mentioned, philanthropy alone will not get us there. This is going to have to be systematic, and it's going to have to be ultimately woven into our cultural fabric, as Maria Elena spoke to there. So this is, you know, I dream of, you know, a bigger mechanism that, rather than being based on something like recreational hunting, perhaps might be based on agriculture and the integration of biodiversity preservation into agriculture. And as it was already said, there was a mention, I think it was Holly mentioned NACA and the North American Waterfowl Management Plan and the achievements when we do get together across jurisdictions to do conservation, and I also salute those. But I really have to say that more than anything, it was Mother Nature who did the recovery of waterfowl populations since the 1970s. It was rain and decades of rain that did it. That when we left enough wetland basins and when we left enough tools at her disposal, it was Mother Nature that did the job of recovery. And so that is where we are going to have to allow our grassland progress to be. And I see that as in integration of healthy habitats with healthy foods. We'll have to somehow get over our square line boundaries to a bigger picture. We'll have to transcend that, such as to get our food production systems in line regionally and ecosystem wide, and across our boundaries with our natural systems, processes, and our ecosystem functions. So I think for all the reasons that so many others have mentioned, we will be much richer for that. And thank you very much.
We did have 2 questions that came in from participants and delegates. And if people want to stay on, both panelists and attendees, to hear some of those answers, I would invite that at this point, but also recognize that it's 2, and so we'll kind of officially close. And those 2 questions, one of them that came up was climate resiliency. And so with all of these different things we're thinking about, all the different programs on the ground, the way this might look across nations, how also do we think about climate change and the impacts that's having, and how do we create something that's responsive and resilient to climate change? And then the second question that came up was around different modalities for conservation. And so seeing maybe land easements that aren't in perpetuity, but land easements that are for a period of time. And how do we deal with that? How do we think about some of these other forms of conservation that are out there? So those are the 2 questions, one around climate resiliency overall, and one about different modes of conservation. We'd invite others in the chat and Q&A at this point too, that panelists can follow up with afterwards. But if anybody has thoughts on those 2 questions who's still on, and people want to hang out, that would be, we'd be happy to have some more conversation here.
I guess I'll go on those 2 questions.
Thanks, Nick.
I guess for the first one on climate resiliency, and talking about, coming from my community, climate change is real. It's real, and it's real every year because out in the rural area, we see it firsthand. We see it from years ago, hail, the size of hail coming pea-size to now there's softball-sized hail coming. We get snow in tons, and then due to climate change, we have tons of water that turn in, that basically flood out our waterways and stuff. But I guess climate resiliency, I see it more within the community base is getting back into home-based production, getting back into reconnecting with our environment and living off the land, utilizing the land for start, utilizing the land, all the way down to the square foot of understanding for production. Because when we talk about climate, when we talk about global warming, when we talk about industry, that involves movement. That involves you going somewhere else to acquire something that you need. But for that to be resilient, it is being more home-based, starting to develop those key infrastructures, those key connectiveness that you need. And food systems are those. We can think of that as in traditional sense, we can think of that as a modern sense, but developing communities that center around food systems will help combat those things that basically plague the world, but also being more connected. And then the other one, what was the other question?
Around different modalities of conservation. So thinking about fixed term easements for landowners, as opposed to landowners who might not want to commit to lands in perpetuity. So different modalities of conservation in that way. Yeah,
we deal with that majorly here, because when we talk about right of ways, when we talk about accesses, when we talk about units of land, those all become political. Those are political things. Be that we are under different forms of government as a sovereign people, with our own government and stuff. And so for us, it's working on those access points to be able to utilize the land, in relation to conservancy, or even for production. But across the board, I'm pretty sure that's the same. But identifying more areas that can help develop out those conservancies or those ecosystems for more production, more migration, because that's what we're talking about too. When we talk about birds, when we talk about buffalo, when we talk about, you know, all of these things, they have migration patterns, and so we need more emphasis on those, but also more emphasis on those systems that help us keep us grounded, but also that help us to thrive as people too in a more natural world. So that's kind of my perspective.
Great, thank you, Nick. Really appreciate that. Christian or Maria?
I mean, that's, yeah, super questions. This makes me think a lot about nature-based solutions. I think that, you know, alternative modalities, well, basically diversity is key in everything, and we will have to be diverse too and accept alternative modalities. For things like that, like for example, fixed term conservation agreements that was mentioned, I do wonder, I do ask myself if that will be a way for us to maybe get something a little bit more dynamic. You know, we do have a model of protected areas or fixed geographies, and I do wonder if ultimately we could get to something a bit more dynamic that allows, but that would have to be, and the only way that would work in my opinion is if that was done within a bigger landscape level sort of plan. So if we had sort of sufficient key areas, key rests, key and sufficient percentages of natural cover maintained at all times and things like that. Of course, I do worry about undoing what we've done. Of course, I do worry that, you know, short-term gains may not translate long enough. So I say this with some trepidation. But I think if we ultimately got it right, that we perhaps could come up with a more dynamic approach to grassland conservation. It really does take us outside of our box of putting a square box and a border and a fence around things and saying this is nature and humans keep out. The whole working lands thing and what it means is absolutely going to require different modalities, absolutely going to require different tools in different regions, absolutely going to require that we give a bit and take a bit, but and compromise a lot probably. But I would like to see us moving the conversation in that direction of something dynamic and what a dynamic system could be that allows for those ecosystem processes and to be maintained, which of course is bison grazing, which of course is fire, which of course is wet and dry and drought, and all of those things that shape the prairie.
Great, thank you, Christian. I just want to point out in the chat, a delegate had posted a resource for a pretty dynamic tool that thinks about what you were saying, Christian, in terms of being less static and more dynamic in our response. And that's a tool by the Nature Conservancy. So that link is posted for people to think about, look at. I know that will likely be part of the conversation during next week's session too. Maria, I know we had a little bit of feedback, but I just want to hand it over to you. I think we're good if you have questions or some ideas about these pieces. Thank you.
Únicamente comentar sobre el tema de las modalidades de conservación. En México sí se han estado buscando estos otros esquemas de promover con la gente, sobre todo porque aquí los dueños de la tierra no es el gobierno, ¿verdad? Toda la tierra tiene ejidos, comunidades, propiedad privada. Entonces, para hacer conservación vía un decreto presidencial se afectan en lo regular muchos intereses y no siempre es muy aceptado un decreto presidencial por la gente, ¿verdad? Sobre todo porque siente afectados sus intereses. Entonces, por ejemplo, la modalidad voluntaria lo que promueve es eso, o sea, el interés del particular, del ejido, de la comunidad indígena por conservar su patrimonio natural, sus recursos naturales, y lo que se hace es de alguna manera certificar esa voluntad y apoyarlos en hacer un programa de manejo que está encaminado a la conservación de la biodiversidad y los recursos naturales. Y es hacer de alguna manera un contrapeso a esta modalidad de decreto presidencial que mucha gente lo puede ver como autoritario, como limitante, como ultraconservacionista, que no permite que la gente realice actividades productivas, por ejemplo, ¿no? Entonces, lo que se trata es justamente que los nuevos decretos de áreas naturales protegidas incorporan participación social, opiniones de la gente, pero sí un esquema regulatorio que garantice la conservación de la biodiversidad a futuro. Sin este esquema regulatorio, difícilmente se puede avanzar, pero sin embargo en el camino tenemos muchas piedras porque no todo el mundo quiere ser regulado. Los grandes empresas agricultoras, las productoras de semillas, las productoras de fertilizantes, de agroquímicos, la minería, o sea, esas grandes empresas no están dispuestas a tener regulación. Y es donde nosotros, por eso buscamos otras modalidades que son voluntarias de los dueños de la tierra, ¿no? Entonces, ese es mi comentario respecto al tema de las modalidades de conservación.
Great. Thank you very much, Maria. Appreciate it. Are there any other questions that some of the co-facilitators, planning committee members are seeing, or that panelists have seen come up that you'd like to respond to at this point? We can take some of them offline and follow up as well.
I mean, just to add to that map that you were sharing, when you look at it, indigenous lands don't even exist on that map. I mean, they're grayed out, which means there's actually no partnerships within that. But I know a lot of it's identified as kind of federal partnerships, but anything else within inside that gray area, those partnerships don't exist. And I know that for truth. So whenever you see that map and you see those gray land areas, those are tribal lands. So yeah, that says a lot to have a gray area that is showing you there's no data coming out of there, which is basically a dead zone.
So do you see the opportunity for partnership there then, Nick, and recognition of what those lands are?
Yeah, I mean, because underneath the tribes here, like for the lands and the tribes in the United States, the partnership is with the federal government on that federal government relationships. But when we're talking about land conservancy, when we're talking about ecosystem building, when we're talking about food systems building, a lot of that philanthropic money, probably I think it's like one less of 1% of funding comes into indigenous communities in North America. And so you're talking about, small pots of money are going to help to develop these systems, to help to regenerate lands, to help create food systems, to bring back, the once thriving, the thriving ecologies. And so when we have maps like that, it shows a lot that there's not a lot of partnerships, that there's not a lot of funding coming in. There's not a lot of and there's not a lot of opportunities being created that should be, especially being the largest land stewards within the Great Plains. So a lot of those perspectives need to be sought out and need to be developed.
Nick, if you're okay, another question came in that I think would kind of go a little bit further with that. And I just want to point out, this is a great example where something that we're talking about in these talks could be elevated to a proposed solution in the roadmap. So increasing funding for partnerships with indigenous and tribal lands could be one of the things I could see as an example of going into the roadmap. And another delegate just asked, how might the various sectors who are working on this roadmap work more closely with tribes. So I think the funding one that's being elevated there is maybe part of the answer to that, but how else can sectors sort of be called out to work more closely?
By partnering with the organizations who are actually on the ground and trying to make and trying to make that change they want to see, because a lot of outside organizations, federal programs have came in, providing a service, but it's organizations like mine that actually never really seen the benefit in a lot of those, or are they really never created an opportunity with that. So a lot of us grassroots organizations or grassroots people alone are taking it upon ourselves to create these opportunities and relative use of resources and development of lands, but also getting familiar with the use of those lands, because we're talking about 85-year-old constitutions. We're talking about 85-year-old policies that are wrapped around accessing of lands and having to work through those red tapes. But when we talk about conservancy, when we talk about use, we talk about reconnection back to the natural world. And so that's what we want to do, and that's what we want to see, because the benefit is there, especially in places that are untapped, not as in the modern term of development, but untapped as in its use to help us grow as a people and help us to acquire those natural things that are naturally created.
Okay. Well, I want to thank all the panelists. I know that Mike and Jim and others are still on from the earlier panel. I want to thank Nick and Maria and Christian for your time today and perspectives, staying with us a bit after 2 to answer some more questions. I think all 3 of your talks elevated some really important themes here that got some energy and ideas and thoughts flowing both from you all and from the attendees. So thank you again for your time and insights. I think we're really getting a sense both of the complexity of this roadmap that we're working on, but also the great opportunity and potential that's coming out of it as well. So thank you for carrying forward the dialogue and these ideas. Thank you for all the attendees who stayed on here a little bit extra. And we just want to highlight next Thursday, July 23rd from 12 p.m. to 2 p.m. Mountain Time. We'll be back with our last speakers before the delegates go into work groups on July 28th. So please join us again. We'll be on YouTube Live and with the Zoom link. So we look forward to seeing everybody back here in a week. And thank you again for your time today. We will officially go off.
Thank you.
Thank you.